Afternoon geographers, so it's another paper 3 video. Now the purpose of this video is to take you through that skill of scan and summarise. Now you've heard me mention that scan and summarise skill in a few of my videos now, particularly the 24 marker videos. And it's that skill of essentially being able to look at something like a figure, whether it's figure 1, 2, 3, 4 or any of the figures within that resource pack, and being able to summarise it within around 30 seconds. Not only is this going to be useful in that first 15 minutes when you're told to read through the resource pack and read through the question pack, it's going to be useful in answering every single question that you've got within the question pack itself, particularly the 18 and the 24 markers when you are asked to engage with the entire resource pack. So there's a number of things that I'd recommend you do as part of this scanning and summarising, and we'll go through those now. So that first thing that I'd recommend you do is write down what the data is actually giving you. So literally just as simple as possible, what variables, what measures do I have to work with? So it could be something as simple as it might be GDP, it might be GDP per capita, it might be parts per million of CO2, it might be levels of elevation, it might be population densities. The list can be endless, but by establishing what we've got here, it starts to generate those ideas of, okay, how can I start to summarise this now? That's your skill 1. Write down the variables and the measures that you've got. Number 2. The next thing you've got to do in terms of a summary, and again this is very, very quick, what is the data, what is the figure actually telling you? So it could be as simple as this figure is telling me that there's an increase in GDP for this country over time. We might also be able to see that there are some fluctuations, and they could be in this year and that year. And it's then at this point that you can pick out things like the highest and lowest. So just generally speaking, we want to be doing a very quick summary of what the data is telling us. Recap, we write down the variables first, we then say, what is the data telling us? What does the graph or the chart tell us? The next thing you can do is establish within that data set where the opportunities for the manipulation of that data set are. So if you remember, one of the core competencies that we've got is that ability to take the raw data or take any of the graphs or the charts and manipulate those figures to symbolize what the significance of a trend or a relationship or a difference might be. You can do that with very, very simple calculations. So for example, something like a line graph where the figure increases from 30 to 100, that's a perfect example of where you can bring in something like multiples, so this has nearly tripled over time, or something like a percentage increase calculation that you can do with a very, very simple formula. So we've got write down the variables, establish what the data is telling us, establish where we might be able to do some sort of significance calculation, particularly useful for those 8 markers. Around the side on the resource pack, write down any theories that this data might be relevant to. So if you spot something where it's, I don't know, it might be environmental determinism, world systems theory, modernization theory, the environmental Kuznets curve, any of these theories that you think might be relevant to the data, write them around that resource pack so you know that when you're engaging with that data source or you're looking to use that data source with a particular type of question, that you can then relate it to theory, because that again is going to boost the AO1 and the AO2 marks within any of your essay responses. And then finally we can start to think about what our critiques of the data sets are, because again, critiques are going to be useful in our essay questions. It's one of those AO3 evaluation skills. We can critique that as a form of evaluation. Things like when we say our argument is strong, but it's only as strong as our data set is reliable or accurate. So for example, a critique of something like GDP might be that it hides regional variations. So that's our scan and summarise skill. Why don't we see that in action? So this is a classic example of a paper 3 resource. It gives you a lot of data in one. So what you have to do is you're not going to note down every individual piece of data that's on there. So remember, that first skill is, what are we working with here? Well, I've got years of schooling, I'll highlight that. I've got governance and rule of law scores, and I've got health, and that is a life expectancy score there, and I've got a bunch of numbers. So what this is telling me is, if I'm going to summarise what the data is telling me, is that there are variations within the ASEAN trade bloc. That's it. That's the summary point. There's variations in education, in governance and rule of law, and life expectancy across the ASEAN region. What else does it show me? It shows me normally that when there is low governance scores, or when there are low governance scores, there are also knock-on effects on education and health. So I can already start to establish those relationships. I've established very quickly that there's a difference between all the ASEAN nations. I've established that there's relationships between certain things like governance and rule of law and education and life expectancy. And I can also start to pick out areas where there might be be some calculations possible. So they might want to emphasize that difference. So for example, Myanmar has a governance and rule of law score of 4.2, whereas Malaysia has 66.2, Brunei 77.9, and Singapore 94.3. So I could do some kind of calculation. What's the multiple? So that might be however many times greater than that. So I'm starting to group together what the highest scoring nations are and the lowest scoring nations are as well. And I can do this within that 30-second time window. Obviously, critiques of this data set are that this gives us a broad overview of these particular countries. It doesn't necessarily break down regional differences within these actual measures themselves, or within the different rural areas or urban areas within these places. So there might be differences within the country, or areas within the country where these scores maybe aren't as high. And remember that critique of the data set is going to be important and maybe get scoring us some AO3 evaluate marks later down the line in terms of your 18 and your 24 markers. Just to show you another example as well, so I've got a different kind of data here, and again this is showing me that there are differences in the levels of interconnectedness of different ASEAN nations. What it tells me is that the mainland countries are very well connected. There's a large range of different transport methods, different ways of being interconnected to other countries, and those that are island nations tend to be less interconnected because of the fragmented nature of their countries. What I can also see is that there are some areas where the coastlines are interconnected, and there's some areas like Borneo where inland areas that are particularly mountainous are not well interconnected. And I can start to connect this to different things that might interfere with infrastructure construction. So something like a mountainous area is a perfect example of that. But once again, what I could say is that a critique of this data set is that it doesn't necessarily show us volume of flows flowing along these. It's just a single thread line and it's a single thickness. So if we were to have that information, maybe we would have a little bit more information about the flows, or the nature of these flows, or how many flow between the different nations at different times of the year. So again, that could give us a little bit more information about the interconnectedness. Another example here from section B. This again shows, we've got that very quick summary straight from the off. I can see that the ASEAN nations have a large range of trading partners, and the majority of these tend to be what you would class as core nations. So again, I'm thinking in terms of core, periphery. I'm thinking core periphery theory. I'm thinking world systems theory. But again, what I can also see is that intra-ASEAN trade is the largest category. So it does show promise in terms of them being self-sufficient within their own trade bloc, mirroring that of the EU potentially at some point in the future. And I can pick out your largest trading partners. So one of the largest trading partners is China, lowest obviously being Russia, and I can calculate the difference between these things. What might become relevant, I might want to add up all these percentages as well, and it looks like over half of the trade with ASEAN nations comes from outside and comes from these core nations. So they are heavily reliant on these core nations. Again, this isn't taking long. It's not taking me long to think about what is this data telling me. Large range of trading partners. I can pick out the highest, I can pick out the lowest, I can pick out that figure of intra-ASEAN trade as well, and I'm doing this very quickly on that first read through. Remember, it's just the scan and summarize that can formulate part of our data, part of our arguments in the later questions. Again, moving down to a figure like this, what we can see immediately is that in the majority of cases, the main trading partner with ASEAN nations is actually intra-ASEAN trade. So their main trading partners are within the inter-ASEAN, and we can see that obviously there's 10 of these nations here, there's 8 of these here. I can do a very quick calculation and say 80%, yeah? So again, that's showing that manipulation of the data set. 80% of the nations in the ASEAN trade bloc trade with other ASEAN nations as their number one trading partner. Then again, I can think outside of this and think, okay, so maybe the second most important trading partner would be China, and then following that probably Japan, because there are a lot of those are in second position. There's an outlier here with Singapore and the EU. What could I link that to? Could be potentially past colonial legacies. Okay, so I'm going through and I'm seeing what I can pick out in that data set. I'm summarizing all the time, thinking about theory that I can link it to, and then that will make our job easier when it comes to actually linking the theories to the arguments that we're making, and we need to score highly in those AO2 marks in the 18 and 24 markers. So that's it, and that was just a short example of your scan and summarize activity, but it is a very useful skill to learn in terms of just getting that scan, that summary, that overview of what the data is trying to tell us. And sometimes that's all we need to get our brains going and thinking about the kind of flavor of the paper. I always talk about this like the flavor of the paper. What's the main data coming through here? What's our main area of focus? What are our main core theories that we need to bring out from that data? So give it a go. Okay, so it's your turn now. Why not have a go at this as you're watching the video? So I'm going to put a 30-second timer on, see if you can make sense of what this data is trying to tell you. Off you go. Great, and what about this one? And finally, what about this one? So there we go, that's just a little taster of what you can potentially do to practice these paper 3 skills before you get into the exam on Friday. It's a really useful thing to do. Just go through all of your past papers, download the resources and just practice looking at something, summarising the key findings of that data, looking at the trends that you can establish, looking at the relationships, looking at the differences, picking out high points, low points, picking out areas where you can do calculations, linking it to theories, and then thinking about that critique of the data set, like it shows us this, but what doesn't it show? That can start to preload those ideas for the critique of the AO3 when you get into the 18 and 24 markers. So give it a go. All the best.